Hi folks, and welcome to the first in a series of lectures on the female gaze. This series of video lectures is supposed to be a kind of accompaniment to my previous lecture series on Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema essay and the concept of the male gaze. So just a quick refresher. The male gaze is structured for Laura Mulvey through two basic features. First, the male protagonist with whom we are made to identify in a film, and the structure of looking that encourages this identification with this protagonist, male figure, and encourages us to objectify women who are erotically displayed on screen. So the question then becomes, if this is the basic structure of the male gaze, and we have a source text that we can look at, that is Laura Mulvey's landmark essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, with which we can ask that question, what is the male gaze? What do we ask about the female gaze? The female gaze is a good example of a concept that's more or less located within popular feminist discourse that has been adapted from a set of academic terms, specifically the term the male gaze. But interestingly, there is no major single source text that defines the female gaze in the same way that a single source text defines the male gaze. So this series of lectures is not going to be a series of definitions that I'm giving, but a series of questions that we can ask to use that concept productively. So the question I want to ask to guide these lectures is this: what do you think, what do we think might be the possible definitions of the female gaze? Here's number one: visual and narrative strategies for depicting men as sexual objects for consumption by heterosexual female spectators. We can call this the reversal hypothesis. And this makes a certain kind of sense. If we think of the male gaze as primarily structured through sexual objectification of women, then a female gaze, we might hypothesize, would have to be the reverse of that, the sexual objectification of men by a presumably heterosexual female audience. Number two, visual narrative strategies that represent the visual dimensions of female desire. And for this, instead of thinking like a film like Magic Mike XXL or Magic Mike, we might turn to 1940s classical Hollywood films known as women's pictures or weepies, many of which, like this still from Letter from an Unknown Woman that you're seeing here, strove to represent female desire from a female point of view. Could that be an example of the female gaze? Number three, visual and narrative strategies that are unique to female filmmakers. Directors, cinematographers, and screenwriters, for instance. This, to me, is, I think, a really popular way of thinking about the female gaze in an age in which we're trying to think more about the ways that we can change the film industry to represent more diverse voices. When we say the female gaze, do we in fact mean who is making the film, who is behind the camera? Or number four, any combination of 1, 2, and 3. If we want to settle on a precise definition of female gaze, do we have to pick from these three possibilities and fine-tune it? For the remainder of this lecture, I want to focus only on this first question: visual narrative strategies for depicting men as sexual objects for consumption by heterosexual female spectators, what we can call the reversal hypothesis. So, if I'm going to imagine Laura Mulvey herself is thinking about someone hypothesizing that this is in fact what they should mean by the female gaze, here's a few ways that I might imagine Mulvey responding and thinking through that hypothesis. So, Mulvey might say, at the very least, this definition of female gaze retains something of the theoretical specificity of the term gaze. So what does she mean by theoretical specificity of the term gaze? Well, Mulvey might point us to the use of the term gaze within the humanities. Look at this list of gazes that have been mentioned throughout humanistic discourse. We have the male gaze, but we also have things like the medical gaze, the orientalist gaze, the colonial gaze, the rich gaze, the straight gaze, the white gaze. And I hope that you're noticing something here. These are all terms that have been coined within academic discourse. And as we look at them in a row, I think it should tell us something about that shared term gaze. Each of these terms, each of these concepts is trying to formulate a structure of power in which the adjective that comes before gaze names an oppressive or dominant aspect of a power structure that might be termed the subject, as opposed to the things that are oppressed or the people that are oppressed, who we might call the object. So the male gaze presumes that it's men looking or objectifying women. The medical gaze, which is an important aspect of the work of Michel Foucault, thinks about the medical institution that objectifies patients. The Orientalist gaze is presuming the dominance of colonialist powers that are oppressing what we might call Orientalized others. More broadly, the colonial gaze is looking at larger groups that we might call the colonized. So Mulvey might say, as you can see, the academic discourse of the gaze is generally about harmful structures of power enacted through relations of looker, subject, and looked at, object. This general idea of looker, subject, and looked at, object, is central to the initial theory of the gaze that I adapted from French philosophers. So now we might actually turn to those very French philosophers that Laura Mulvey was looking at in order to adapt her theory of the male gaze, which I think is by far the most famous of those terms that has made it beyond the constraints of academia. So the person that Laura Mulvey most directly invokes in her essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, is psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And Lacan has himself a theory of the gaze, one that is actually not located in feminism, but is a broader philosophical claim about something that happens to human beings as they form themselves as what he calls subjects. So I can summarize it this way. In Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, the gaze is the anxious state of mind that comes with the self-awareness that one can be seen and looked at. The psychological effect upon the person subjected to the gaze is a loss of autonomy upon becoming aware that he or she is a visible object. Theoretically, the gaze is linked to the mirror stage of psychological development, in which a child encountering a mirror learns that he or she has an external appearance. So think about this for 1 second. We talked about the mirror stage in the previous videos, but the idea that Lacan is getting at is that there is an important moment in the development of human beings when they are infants, when they no longer think of themselves as this bodiless, transcendent, perceptual apparatus, that is, an eye seeing the world, and they start to realize that their eyes are located in a body that themselves can be looked at and, in a sense, objectified by everybody else. And that realization is a particularly anxious one. It's a one where you realize your own vulnerability. It's no longer that I can just see everything that I desire, but I start to realize that other people, everyone in the world, can see me too. And this theory of the gaze from Jacques Lacan is not all that different from an earlier version of the gaze that was developed by French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre in Being and Nothingness. He says, quote, "We cannot perceive the world and at the same time apprehend a look fastened upon us. It must be either one or the other. This is because to perceive is to look at, and to apprehend a look is not to apprehend a look as object in the world. It is the consciousness of being looked at." And he seems to be saying that when you see somebody else looking at you, you're not, say, looking at their looking. Rather, what you are doing is looking or becoming aware of the fact that you are being looked at. And that is really, really difficult to overcome. And the gaze is the word that he has for this consciousness of being looked at, of being an object for the look of other people. And there's something about that that freezes us, stops us in our place. So Mulvey might say, Sartre and Lacan theorized the gaze, the anxious realization that you can be looked at by others, as a universal human condition. But I adapted it as a concept to describe a particular condition experienced by women under patriarchy. So, at the very least, if we return to this hypothesis about the female gaze merely being a reversal of the male gaze, right? Visual narrative strategies for depicting men as sexual objects for consumption by heterosexual female spectators. Mulvey might say, once again, so at the very least, the above definition of a female gaze usefully adopts that subject-object power dynamic that is inherent to the academic use of that term gaze. However, Mulvey might say, I suggested in Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema that the erotic display of men in films cannot produce a complete reversal of the power structures that maintain the male gaze. So here we have to return to the text and see where she says this. So here it is. She will say, according to the principles of the ruling ideology, by which she means patriarchy, and the psychical structures that back it up, by which she means the tenets of Freudian psychoanalysis. The male figure cannot bear the burden of sexual objectification. Man is reluctant to gaze at his exhibitionist like. So Mulvey might say, I wasn't hypothesizing about female spectators here, which she wasn't, but I was hinting at the idea that you can't have a genuine reversal of the male gaze when the dominant power structure is still patriarchy. Just because a man is displayed on screen or even looked at erotically by a female character, it doesn't mean we are in the presence of a quote-unquote female gaze. So here I might just make a very simple but important point, that the term gaze is not synonymous with the term look. Gaze is a specialized academic term that bears the weight of its predecessors in Lacan and Sartre. The term look is simply an ordinary word that points to the faculty of vision. Feminist philosopher Elizabeth Gross would make this very distinction in her own work, Voyeurism, Exhibitionism, and the Gaze. She writes, many feminists have conflated the look with the gaze, mistaking a perceptual mode with a mode of desire. When they state baldly that vision is male, the look is masculine, or the visual is a phallocentric mode of perception, these feminists confuse a perceptual facility open to both sexes with sexually coded positions of desire within visual or any other perceptual functions. In other words, anybody can look. Looking and vision itself are not privy to one gender or another. To use the word gaze to describe a particular sexually coded and power-coded way of looking is not simply to point at looking itself. Mulvey might echo this and say, for an erotically charged look to be an instance of the gaze, it needs to reflect larger structures of power. See what I mean? Once again, note all of the importantly academic terms that have used the gaze. Each one of them is describing a power structure with a clear division between the ones who hold power and the ones who don't, implying that the ones who hold power often look at those who don't in a way that makes the oppressed, those without power, feel the anxiety that comes from being looked at within this power structure, being looked at and hence objectified, reduced to something that is not human, that doesn't retain the subjectivity, the power, the autonomy that we should invest in all human beings. So we will get echoes of this opinion even in popular discourses of the gaze that we see on YouTube. Popular YouTuber Lindsay Ellis, who does cultural criticism, actually echoes this way of thinking when she brings up the male gaze in one of her videos.
Mulvey's idea of male gaze holds that women on film are objects for male fetishistic gazing, with men as the de facto subject. And what about female gaze, retorts the internet strawman. According to Mulvey, the language of film was made by male filmmakers for male audiences. Female gaze isn't really a thing because even if, say, a female filmmaker tries to invert the idea of male gaze by fetishizing male bodies, it still uses the same language and techniques that male filmmakers use to create a gaze upon female bodies, just substituting male bodies with female bodies. So, according to the Mulveyan viewpoint, Magic Mike XXL still falls under the purview of male gaze.
So what might Laura Mulvey say? She might say this. Though I never quite said this, Mulvey never quite said what Lindsay Ellis is saying here, I nonetheless agree with Lindsay Ellis. The visual rhetoric of objectification in general can or might in fact be called the male gaze, regardless of who is being objectified. However, here's where Mulvey might object. But has Lindsay Ellis watched the film closely? That is, Magic Mike XXL. Why not actually apply the kinds of analysis that I used to investigate cinematic instances of eroticized male bodies? So notice that Lindsay Ellis didn't in fact look closely at Magic Mike XXL, but rather just presumed the bare fact that it is a film that objectifies male bodies for our visual pleasure. But Mulvey's essay is interested in looking at films closely, looking at the kinds of visual structures and narrative structures that they exhibit. So why don't we at least try the Mulveyan mode of interpretation and apply it in a very cursory and brief way to a film like Magic Mike XXL. The first thing that Mulvey might note is that Magic Mike XXL is driven by male characters in terms of the story. It is a group of men who begin the film, and it is a group of men who end the film. At no point is our identification not focalized through Mike and his friends. But here's where the opposition to Lindsay Ellis's point might be made clear. In the film, male bodies are displayed erotically and women are shown consuming men as an erotic spectacle, as in these sequences that litter the film in which we see men stripping and women surrounding them consuming that stripping as a visual spectacle. But how are those sequences displayed to us, the viewer? And how are we instructed to watch them? Are we in fact encouraged to identify with female lookers? Is this particular shot, as one simple instance, designed to get us to identify with any one female character who might be looking? Well, no. None of these women that I've circled are in fact characters that we know or identify with. However, the person who is closest to the position of the camera, and who is in fact the protagonist of the film, Mike, is watching this visual display, and we are meant to identify with Mike's visual consumption of this display. It's the men that are often the ones looking at other men who we are asked or compelled to identify with. And there's Mike again. And this is more or less how these sequences are often, though maybe not entirely, structured. In the now famous gas station scene, we oscillate not only between Richie and the woman that he's trying to get to watch him do an erotic display. She's in fact not paying attention at all. We more so oscillate between him and his male buddies who are watching from the window. Once again, it's the men that are often the ones looking at other men who we are asked to identify with. So Mulvey might say, even a cursory look at how the film's narrative is structured and how certain sequences of male erotic display are edited can immediately dispel simplistic claims about the film's status as an instance of the female gaze on the one hand and as an instance of the male gaze on the other. Mulvey was interested in things like plot structure and editing structure and identification as the criteria by which she came up with this thing that she called the male gaze. And I would encourage students who are thinking about this term to do the same, regardless of the conclusions that they come up with. That's it for our first investigation of what the female gaze could be as a term. I'll see you next time to look at numbers 2, 3, and 4. Thanks.